I'd like now to introduce our visiting fellow at the Institute. We have Dr. Gavin Lee. Dr. Gavin Lee is Assistant Professor of Music at Soochow University, a researcher in decolonial and queer theory. He is the author of Estrangement from Ethnicity, Music and Sinophone Alienization, forthcoming with you, Mitch, and editor of 2 volumes Queer Ear, in production with Oxford University Press, and Rethinking Difference in Gender, Sexuality and Popular Music with Routledge. Gavin is an IC visiting fellow and has led a number of interesting projects here with us at the Institute. We're very, very happy that he's here today with us. Thank you, Gavin.
Thanks, Nicholas, for that introduction. So my paper is drawing on a couple of things. It's drawing on sound studies and voice studies, including work by Ray Chow, anthropology of sound, including work by William Labov, but especially queer musicology, queer musicality, queer listening, and intersectionality. Particularly the work of Suzanne Cusick, who was the former president of the American Musicological Society, Philip Brett, one of the founders of queer musicology, and Stephen Pennington, who's written about trans Black music makers. And also, I'm happy to be here as the sole representative of someone who's actually based in China and someone who's outside of literary studies. So very happy to meet all of you. Some of you may know that I'm organizing a symposium on queer Chinese music on April 15th of April. As I was thinking about what I could speak on today, I at first thought about queer Chinese music makers. For example, the theme song sung by the 2 male protagonists of the Chinese television series The Untamed, which is based on a popular boy love story, or another topic I was thinking of was the culture of amateur K-pop dancing in Shanghai clubs. Ultimately, I chose to actually write an autoethnographic paper about my own experiences as a queer Chinese musicologist. I thought I would take this opportunity to unfold my thinking about the process of the formation of my queer and Chinese identities and their intersectionality. So this is not about queer Chinese music, but about queer Chinese listening, and not about queer Chinese voices per se, but about queer Chinese ears. Like many of you, I've lived in several countries and continents, and I do identify as queer and Chinese now, but this is something that unfolded over 4 decades. So I'm talking about how living in different oppressive contexts caused me to develop an awareness of my queer and Chinese identities on different timelines. And the rest of this is going to be much more of a narrative style, because I don't like to be too theoretical all the time. So part 1, queer ear. As an adolescent growing up in homophobic surroundings in Singapore, where I was born, there were no openly queer Asian figures that I could think of in any medium aside from a single novel set in Singapore, which my then boyfriend had given to me. At the time, in the 90s, there were no gay figures on Singaporean television, and my knowledge of gays came exclusively from the gender studies section of the Borders bookstore in downtown Singapore, which has since closed. I listened to the music of US and UK boy bands and bought their CDs, and I found in Western art music an escape hatch leading to a world beyond the boundaries of my own suffocating context. I didn't know that Elton John and Benjamin Britten were gay, or that Madonna and Kylie Minogue have a gay following. So what I practiced was queer listening. There is a distinction between queer listening as opposed to queer music making. Any queer person can listen, but not every queer person has the freedom to express themselves musically. Queer listening was critical for me because in the Singapore of my youth, there were, as far as I knew, no professional queer music makers aside from the gay Chinese musicals composer Dick Lee. Singapore announced the decriminalization of gay sex only last year. Today I live in China, where, as many people have noted, queer culture is increasingly suppressed. Queer music makers such as Soochow are scrubbed completely from the Chinese internet. Queer composers remain in the closet, invisibilized, and it would be unethical for a musicologist like me to expose their sexuality against their will. There is only a small handful of publications on queer Chinese music, though 1 in 5 people on the planet is Chinese. What I described above relates to what in Asian American studies is called narrative scarcity. There is a narrative scarcity or shortage of visible queer music makers for people like me who are from countries governed by homophobic regimes. narrative scarcity is a lot worse for queer Chinese music makers than for QT BIPOC US composers, in part because of the success of the LGBTQ rights movement and queer, trans, and intersectional theory in the US, and I would say in Australia. Queer listening is a form of queering. Queering is what queers do for survival, being born usually into heterosexual unions. As a queer Chinese person, I felt alienated from my family as a child, not because I was Chinese, we were all Chinese, but because I was queer and my parents were homophobic. Young queers are more often than not stealing crumbs from the heteronormative dinner table to build secret worlds. For so many queers, as we see now in shows like Glee, that secret world was music. Musicality itself is arguably queer, for music is populated with queer performers and composers. At one point, the male singers of the Singapore Youth Choir were 100% queer. Queer teenage boys like me took heterosexual presenting male pop stars and turned them into our homosexual objects of desire. Later, as a music scholar, I cast my queer gaze on the heteronormative narrative of the German art song cycle Dichte Liebe, discovering queer temporal short circuits, such as in the opening song, where the poet toggles a total of 5 times between the alternate realities of love and rejection. As a closeted teenager, I did not have a queer voice, but I used my queer ear to build an inner world in which I could find refuge from homophobia. At that time, I did not stop to ask myself why, as a Chinese person, the music I listened to was composed mostly by white people. Unlike in China, Singapore promoted Singaporean identity, and many Chinese Singaporeans actually rejected Chinese identity, associating it with China, which is seen negatively as authoritarian and backwards. Like many of my peers, I read English books and listened to English language pop music, unaware of the effects of language ideology in a country where English is the official language of government and business, where the ability to speak English well is highly prized. Several of my peers who went to study in the UK returned with a British accent, which was perceived to be more classy. Unaware that we had unknowingly subscribed to cultural imperialism, we became alienated from Chinese identity from ourselves, and that's the subject of my forthcoming book. Part 2. Chinese voice. An ear listens out for music and is capable of building rich inner worlds, but an ear doesn't speak. To be heard by others, we need to have a voice. Marginalized voices are heard through the filter of prejudices. In Singapore, all students are taught using the English language. However, students are divided into the so-called English-educated students who speak primarily English at home and are usually from a small handful of Christian missionary high schools, versus the rest of the Chinese-educated students who speak primarily Chinese at home with their parents. As is the case elsewhere, the sound of one's voice speaking English, one's pronunciation and accentuation, determine how people hear you. Those with a Chinese accent or Singlish accent versus the standard Singaporean accent used in news broadcasts were deemed lower class. During my high school years, I didn't pay that much attention to my voice. It was when I moved to the UK for college that I suddenly became very self-aware of my different accent and gradually picked up bits and pieces of the so-called London and Oxford accents, though of course, I was never able to sound fully native. It was during this time that I developed the consciousness of being a racial minority. In Singapore, I had thought of Chineseness primarily in terms of different levels of English ability of English versus Chinese educated Chinese people. Throughout 6 years of high school, I only had one Malay classmate. Today, I realized that I, as a Chinese Singaporean, have the Chinese privilege of assuming the Chinese viewpoint to be the default. I became self-conscious about my Asian identity only during my UK years, when I was racialized by strangers who yelled out Chinese or Japanese across the street. Returning to Singapore after my master's degree to teach high school, I put aside some time to write a book on Singaporean composers who are little known in the West. But beyond knowing about music in Singapore, can there be a Singaporean, Chinese, or Asian voice when it comes to knowledge production? In December last year, I gave a talk for National Tsinghua University in Taiwan, in which I critiqued Western research methodologies based on my engagement with Sinophone discourses from Singapore and China. For example, I argued that scholars engaged in ethnography-based ethnomusicological research on Chinese music must have advanced, as opposed to moderate, music performance and language skills. A Chinese perspective on research methodology may be regarded as a Chinese voice. But as with the speaking voice, it is often the case that my epistemic voice is filtered by prejudice. I've lived in the Sinophone soundscape of Singapore for 27 years and China for 7 years. This is compared with the cumulative 2 or more years of fieldwork experience of most European and US-based scholars. Yet when I or others based in Asian geographies present our work on Sinophone soundscapes, the response has been often dismissive. Sometimes the response is to cite a published piece of research without an awareness that what is published in English and other European languages represents only a small fraction of what is happening in a particular soundscape. Based on these publications, which are usually limited to specific time periods, say the interwar years, a responder might make extrapolations to form a composite, sometimes heavily misconstrued mind map about the soundscape. Another time, the Asian presenter's whole framework was called into question. In dinner conversations, some responders assume that we are just expressing our own prejudices instead of presenting our research. As for why global musicologists are treated as if they come from a land where knowledge is outdated and frozen in time, we have a familiar term for this: Orientalism. Epistemic Orientalism directed at global musicologists results in the recolonization of global geographies through knowledge. Ironically, it is with the most advanced theory on race and decoloniality emanating from North America and Europe that global scholars, often in former colonies, are recolonized. Frequently, it is the case that the anti-racist and decolonial tenets in question, often new but sometimes also old, which are crafted by North American or European scholars, these tenets are a much better fit for North American and European contexts than for material global practices with different histories and formations of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. Any deviation from the latest anti-racist decolonial rules set in stone by North American/European scholars is taken to mean that global scholars are uneducated. For instance, anti-essentialism or anti-stereotyping is central to North American and European scholars because this relates to how global people were and are seen through North American European lenses. It is of course not the case that anti-essentialism is completely irrelevant elsewhere, but that anti-essentialism is especially important for milieus which historically wielded or currently wields global power and thus developed a global purview through which others were frequently misrecognized and disparaged. From the Chinese standpoint, anti-essentialism is one among many other priorities. In concluding this section, I would note from the simple fact that voices have to be heard to be recognized, that we can actually already discern that the speaking voice is not merely an agent of self-expression, but is filtered by, and in that sense produced by, another person's ear. Realizing that ears often hear others through filters means that all of us have to make the extra effort to listen in less prejudiced, more compassionate ways. Part 3. Queer Chinese ear for a queer Chinese voice. I might say that I grew a Chinese ear over the past 7 years in China when I began to listen very intensively to Chinese music, especially traditional Chinese music. Just like the queer ear, a Chinese ear does not have any musical limitations. Chinese ears listen to symphonies, rap, and routine music, whether performed or composed by Chinese white or other peoples. In the 21st century, is a Chinese ear listening to Beethoven colonized or agential? Probably both. But if Chinese ears are to some extent culturally colonized, there is also a positive side to listening to all kinds of music. Chinese ears that assemble Beethoven and Guqin music in the same playlist do not correspond to the coercive identity GPS that pigeonholes Chinese people as crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Queer Chinese ears, it follows, do not necessarily have to listen to queer Chinese music makers. Otherwise, people with multiple identities face ever-shrinking playlists. And queer Chinese music makers do not necessarily perform music that is markedly queer Chinese or queer Chinese. The problem of narrative scarcity, which I raised earlier, makes it unlikely that queer Chinese people will only ever listen to queer Chinese music, since queer Chinese music makers remain in the closet a lot of the time. Queer Chinese voices are heard through filters, like Chinese voices in general. As a gay man and as an Asian man, I've been doubly subjected to caricaturization as effeminate in the US, such that whenever I speak, others feel the need to speak over me. People speak over me at conference panels I've chaired, and in the process of putting together books and special journal issues I've edited. They feel uncomfortable having me and a gay Asian male as a leader and try to teach me how to chair panels, or they try to take my place, appropriating my labor and my arguments. They assume that I know next to nothing, that I'm drawing on theories as backwards as the 19th century, that my statements are based on guesswork rather than research, that my research methodology is faulty, the list goes on. As a queer Asian male, I do have a special investment in redefining Asian masculinity as well as gay masculinity. This is parallel to what earlier queer theorists did in appropriating the originally derogatory queer. I plan to re-articulate the stereotypically effeminate positionality of the gay Asian bottom, which is the presumed default position of gay Asians as featured in the white gay pornographic imaginary. Gay Asian bottom positionality corresponds to the queer Chinese ear. Just like ears, bottoms are often misrecognized as passive in contrast to tops and to the gentle speaking voices. But in BDSM, it is the bottom who is in charge of the scenario, who controls the intensity of the sensations that may be visited upon them with permission. In parallel, as I've argued, ears, while seemingly passive, actually have a lot of power. Ears have world-building abilities. Ears determine how voices are heard. Ears break free of the stranglehold of identity boxes. In homophobic regimes of censorship, queer Chinese ears are not always able to hear queer Chinese voices in a normal way. Thus, queer Chinese ears have developed ultrasonic abilities in order to find new ways to territorialize inhospitable social spaces. Queer Chinese ears can still hear Chinese pop with gay subtexts and K-pop that inspire amateur dancers in Shanghai gay clubs. But as I've shown in this paper, queer Chinese ears can also protect vulnerable teenagers, hear others compassionately, and defy what has been called the racial castration of Asian men in the West. Queer Chinese ears, like all ears, enable voices to be heard at all, including queer Chinese voices. And as a final note, I would just say that I'm still thinking about how to extend this in a decolonial direction and to think about what listening and hearing means for queer Tibetans, queer Uyghurs in China, and queer Malays and queer Indians in Singapore. But that will bring me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.